really delighted to welcome you all to this session today and to the virtual conference. So just a bit of information about how this session will run. We have a whole lot of questions that have been pre-submitted to the panel, so I'll be running through some of those. But our preference is also to give our attendees a chance to ask questions live. So in order to do that, there's a few things you can do. The best way to get your voice heard is to use the hand raise button, and just wave your hand. We'll then enable your microphone, and you can ask the question out loud and potentially join in the conversation. The other way that you can do it is just use the Q&A box and type your questions out, and we'll address those as we go. Please also feel free to use the chat. I just would encourage you to make sure that you've set your chat to all panelists and attendees rather than just to panelists, just to make sure that you're communicating with everyone who's watching over the course of the next hour. So to get started, I'm actually going to ask each of our investors just to introduce themselves very briefly. I'll ask you all, please, just to give me your name and your organisation, and just a sentence or two about when we talk about investing in longevity, how you come at this, what your background is as an investor. So Cliff, we'll start with you, please.
Thanks, I'm Cliff Pryor. I'm currently CEO at Big Society Capital, the UK's wholesale social impact investor. And for us, ageing society, longevity is a major social impact area, and we've been working on that for some time. Just to say, as of next week, I'm CEO of the Global Steering Group on Impact Investing.
Thanks, Cliff. Laurence, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Laurence Barker. I'm a partner with the Dementia Discovery Fund. We're a venture capital fund focused very heavily on age-related dementias, and that's developing therapeutics for age-related dementias, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, frontotemporal dementia, and so on. The list, unfortunately, is rather long. Hello.
Thanks, Lauren. Gerald, over to you.
Thanks, Angela. So I'm Gerald Moser. I'm the Chief Market Strategist at Barclays Private Bank. And longevity is one of the themes that we have, among others, in our impact advisory proposition that we include both for advice to client and also in our discretionary portfolio.
Wonderful. Thanks, Gerald. And Reenie?
I'm Reenie McCarthy. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Stealth Biotherapeutics. We're a NASDAQ-listed company. We're developing mitochondrial targeted medicines for diseases, including diseases of aging. So we have a late-stage program in dry AMD.
Thanks, Reenie. And Alice? Oh, Alice, just on mute.
Other way. Hi, I'm Alice Wagner. I'm an MD for Strategy and Economics at the British Business Bank, which is the largest domestic institutional investor into UK venture capital. So, for example, the Dementia Discovery Fund is one of ours, and of which we are very proud of. And
thank you.
Yeah, and that's kind of how we come via the longevity agenda.
Great, thanks, Alice. And Xinhong.
Hi, I'm Xinhong. I'm a director at Vickers Venture Partners. Vickers is a top-ranked global, consistently performing VC. We invest in early-stage companies that are tackling huge unmet needs with defensible approaches and have groundbreaking technology. And I think we're most well-known in the longevity life sciences field for our investment in Samumet, which is pursuing a platform of therapeutics that are addressing age-related diseases, and that's yielded a lot of promising data that's propelled them to be the highest value private biotech in the market today.
Thanks, Xinhong. And Jonathan.
You're on mute.
Yeah, hi. Jonathan Synett. I'm the Chief Investment Officer at NCL Technology Ventures. We're an early stage venture capital fund focused on healthcare, and so our interest in longevity and aging comes with businesses that are looking at their health and societal aspects of an aging population.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. Well, welcome everyone. So, like I mentioned, we have a lot of questions lined up. I will ask our participants just a reminder that if you would like to ask a question of this panel, to please use the hand raise button. We will come to enable your microphone. It might not be immediately, but I will make note of that and we'll enable your microphone to ask your question out loud. You can also use the Q&A box, And please feel free to use the chat. Just make sure that the chat is set to panelists and attendees so that you're communicating with everyone. But first of all, I'm going to start actually with one of the questions that was pre-submitted. And that's looking at the fact that it's really only a matter of time until longevity investing becomes the largest market, or a significant market for people looking to invest generally. So how can we avoid hype, which might be driven by valuations or companies that aren't so solid, and then subsequent downturn? And actually, just to get things moving, I'm going to throw to you first, Reenie, to give some insight on this, please.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I come at this from the therapeutics development perspective. So I think just making sure investors are well educated about the timelines for drug development. It takes a very long time. There can be ups and downs. And I think because aging is such a universally appealing subject, it may attract investors who are less savvy about what biotech drug development life cycles look like. So I do think investor education is important, both to avoid some of the hype as well as the risk of potential downturns.
Does anyone else on the panel like to address that question? Yes, please, Alice.
Okay, sorry, I'm trying the raising hand, literally, sort of option here. What I would say is that although we do have a lot of conversations today going on about life sciences and therapeutics, longevity as a play is actually much broader than that. And I would encourage people to sort of think more laterally about that, because that tends to avoid some of the hype. Housing, for example, is a big challenge. There's things like financial services that might have a play. There's a lot of digital, for example, and mobility solutions, for example, that have, autonomous driving, for example, is great for all of us, but it's particularly important for an aging society. And so one of the ways to try and avoid the hype, as with anything in investing, is to go where other people aren't going and to go laterally.
Yeah. Xinhong, we'll come to you.
Oh, is that me now?
Yes, please.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'd like to echo what both Reenie and Alice said. And I think, first of all, it's about investor education about the risks that are present, right? Regulatory risk is one of those. And also, it's what's technical risk, what's the market risk, what's the defensibility risks. And these are common themes, regardless of what sort of specific sector in longevity or sciences that we're looking at. And really, it's about what's the data, right? Especially with the life sciences companies, there will be many claims that are made, some which would be stronger than others. And at the end of the day, as long as the investors are cognizant of the risks that are involved, they can and should then take a very systematic and rigorous approach to dissecting the claims that are made, understanding the risks, and asking what sort of data there is to support the claims. And if the data is not currently there, then what's the gap that's remaining? And is that gap bridgeable? And the investor would then have to make that call about whether or not this would then be an investable proposition given the trajectory and the roadmap ahead and given the risks.
Thank you. Cliff, I'll come to you next.
Thank you. I'm just going to pick up from Alice's comment. I mean, I think certainly in the UK, and I think in a number of other jurisdictions, what COVID has thrown up is the absolute chaos and shambles of the care home industry for people in later life. That will have to change. The public pressure for change will be absolutely enormous. And then, now people are starting to look at, well, okay, it's not just about age, it's also about comorbidities, and particularly around obesity. So, what do we know about obesity, diabetes? We know it's all linked to social and economic activity. So I think there's a very wide platform for investors to be looking at in this, and it's been there all the time. It's just come hugely in the COVID crisis.
Yeah. Jonathan.
Yeah, I suppose it's very difficult to avoid the hype in any kind of investment. I think all sectors are going to go through. They're going to go through hype, and they're going to go through downturn, and longevity will be the same and is to a certain extent the same, particularly as it will attract, I think, investors who, and I think it's been talked about other panelists, like it's attracting a lot of high net worth investors rather than some institutional investors. And, you know, sometimes they go up and down with the market. Longevity is by definition, it is a long-term investment strategy. And so I think for investors coming into it, that it's a long-term play. And even to a certain extent for us as a 10-year fund investing in longevity therapeutics, we maybe don't even have a long-term, our horizon's not long-term enough for that. So it's truly long-term when you're going into the therapeutic side, and even on the, you know, age tech and societal side, it's still a long-term game.
Thanks, Jonathan. Gerald, did you have something to, yep, please go for it.
Yes, no, I just wanted to say, in our view, there's like 3 different phases in the way you can think about it. There's the first order, which is directly the biotech investment, i.e. finding a solution for a longer living. And I think this is probably the riskiest, but the one which, of course, is also potentially the most upside, where you have that hype developing. Then we have the second order, which is what I would call the enabling, which is, you know, either the care home, the med tech, providing support for a better quality of longer life, rather than just trying to extend it. And then I think there's the third order, which for me is probably the most interesting and the most long-lasting, which is all the change in society we'll see because of the longevity, the fact that retiring at 60 or 65 is not an option anymore. The fact that you need to retrain people. And I think what we see with this crisis, with the COVID-19, is that more and more things are done online with flexibility. And I think that additional flexibility is something that will help also over time the longevity revolution, as I would like to call it, in the same way than, you know, women entering the labor market, the fact that now we will have senior people working more and more, you know, until they are 70, 80, I think this is the kind of revolution that we have to focus on. And there, the thematic of investment is probably retraining, learning, and better accessibility, flexibility. We talked about mobility. I think those are all like transversal investment opportunities that are linked to longevity.
Great. Thank you, Gerald. And just welcome, Jens. Nice to see you. I might ask you just to give a couple of lines about yourself, please. Just your name and company, and just a little bit about how you come at this space as an investor, please.
Yeah, Jens Eckstein. I'm with Apollo Health Ventures. I've joined last summer. I've been in biotech for 30 years and in investing for 15 years. I've always liked the early stage. I'm also a Kaufman Fellow, so I'm always routing for entrepreneurs and new and crazy ideas. I'm very excited about investing in companies that will change the paradigm, essentially, how we look at disease. Thank you, Jens. And actually, you've joined at an appropriate time for one of the second pre-submitted questions that we have. Just a reminder to everyone who's listening, we'd love for you to ask your questions out loud. So if you're happy to come on microphone, please just use your hand raise button and we'll enable your microphone so that you can ask your questions directly. But in the meantime, one of the questions that was submitted ahead of this was looking at the fact that clinical trials of anti-aging drugs are very complex, very timely, and we don't really have a clear pathway yet. So there was some interest in some thoughts on companies releasing anti-aging drugs off-label, and wondering what our investor panel thought about this, looking at things like ethics and risk. So, and I'm aware that not everyone on this panel is a biotech investor, but actually, Jens, I might throw to you first if you're happy to give some thoughts on that, please. I mean, I think it's a very delicate question. Ultimately, I mean, it should be a decision that's between a patient and a doctor, right? I mean, I think nobody can really make this decision except a treating physician. You know, there can be cases made where it makes sense, but you know, I would not comment on this. I would not push this. I think it is absolutely between a physician and his patient how they deal with this. Thank you. Would anyone else like to make a comment on that? And so, Reenie, I saw you
Raising your eyebrows. Any thought?
I was flinching a little bit at I mean, you obviously have to be extremely careful about claims in that situation as a company if you're producing a therapeutic that could be used for off-label use. But I do think that you see expanded traction around expanded access and rights to patient, right to try, certainly in the United States. So to Jan's point, I certainly think it should be a discussion between a physician and their patient. But I do think that companies have to be very careful treading, in terms of what they're trying to suggest or say about their drugs before they're approved.
And how do you, and anyone is welcome to feed in here, how do you look at this as an investment piece? What might some thoughts be there to companies who are maybe considering approaching this space? Looking specifically at off-label drugs, your advice as an investor, is anyone happy to feed in on that? Fine, if not, we can move on. So I can see Tom Weldon has raised a question here. Tom, I'm going to enable your microphone. Give me just one moment to come online. Hi there, Tom.
Hi. So just have a few comments. My background's in the medical device area, but I've certainly been extremely familiar with the FDA over the years and have been to a lot of panel meetings, etc. So sympathetic is not a word that I would particularly associate with the FDA. And so as you think about off-label use, that's sort of something that you would do in the very back of your mind. One thing I think that a lot of people in the longevity sector don't appreciate is that the FDA, when approving a product, always looks at risk versus reward, and they don't view aging as a disease. So the reward of living longer is not a reward at all. So when you're talking about treating people who are healthy, on an off-label basis to try and get them to live longer, the thing I think most people don't really focus on is the tolerance for safety is essentially going to be zero. If there are any side effects, they're going to come down like a ton of bricks. And if you think that, and of course I've been a venture capitalist as well as an entrepreneur for dozens of years, from an investment perspective, if you're pitching a professional investor that part of your revenue or even the majority of your revenue is going to come from off-label use, that's, I think, a very naive approach.
Thanks, Tom. Does anyone have any comments they'd like to add to Tom's thoughts there? Reenie, please go ahead.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. I think that's one of the challenges in longevity therapeutics specifically. I think we can look at diseases of aging right now. I don't think we can look at aging because you're right, it's not a disease. And obviously the safety profile, for drugs that are approved by the FDA are approved on actually an indication specific basis even. So it is very challenging to promote in any way off-label use. I don't think it's something that's appropriate.
Thank you, Reenie.
I mean, the one comment I would probably make is that, of course, what potentially is a game changer are surrogate biomarkers, right? Because if we can actually connect a disease process to a biomarker and not to aging as such or to normal aging endpoints, then it's really a different game, because then you actually sit on the mechanism and you have a biological effect that you can actually track, and you can track it scientifically. And I think that is probably the biggest challenge for us to develop drugs for age-related diseases. But I think those will also really be the game changers. I mean, those will really enable us to look at disease processes preventively in a very different way.
Thank you, Jens. So, Tom, I'll bring you back in again. Please go ahead, Tom.
Oh, sorry, I was waiting for the sign that was okay to talk.
No problem.
So this is another area that I think also is a bit misunderstood in terms of how it relates to the FDA. So biomarkers are incredibly important, right? I mean, DNA methylation, other things have come on the scene and, are backed up with good data, taking a look at blood bank data over decades, et cetera. But from the FDA's perspective, if you were looking for approval using a biomarker, they will not view a biomarker as being a validated marker for FDA approval. And the only way you can get it approved as a validated marker is to do a trial until everybody is dead and then go back and look whether or not the biomarker was predictive. And that's, of course, a trial that no one will ever do. So in terms of raising money and convincing patients, I think biomarkers are incredibly important. But if you, again, are looking for the use of biomarkers to get FDA approval, I think I don't think it's going to be a successful strategy unless the FDA considers it validated, and the only way you can validate it is to do the trial that nobody will afford and take the time to do, in my opinion.
I mean, the way out of this is of course, if I mean, you have to prove to the FDA that your biomarker is connected to a very specific mechanism, right? I mean, the mechanism of action is the central point here. If your biomarker is connected to the mechanism of action, and you can validate a biomarker in a small trial of a either genetic phenotype or an accelerated phenotype that sits on that mechanism, you can validate that biomarker. And then in the next step, you can use the biomarker, because the FDA will accept biomarkers that are directly correlating with the mechanism. It's very much driven by a mechanism. I agree, you cannot just take any old blood marker where there might be a correlation. That is a very, very hard way to go, but it's very much mechanism driven.
Thank you, Jens. Please, Xinhong, go for it.
Yeah, maybe I just add that, again, it's all anchored around how we approach this. I think, as Jens has said, it would be a big leap to go directly into lifespan extension, for instance. And just like what Reenie has said, I think the more tractable approach that we have sort of coalesced around is to go for age-related diseases, where there's a clear, sometimes clear mechanism of action, where there can be biomarkers that can be defined, where there is a clear regulatory path forward. So it really fits into this more traditional and conventional model of drug development. And these same markers or mechanisms may also be involved in lifespan extension, but companies have to be very careful around the claims that they make around that. And I mean, this is the strategy that we see for many companies, right? They're essentially going for age-related diseases and sort of hinting at association with lifespan extension. I think that's reasonable as long as we're very clear about what the data says and what the findings do support. The reality is that it's currently not tractable. I think given the lack of definition of aging as a disease, given the lack of a clear regulatory path forward to go for this, for aging specifically as a disease indication. So I think age-related diseases is the more tractable path forward, at least in the near term. For investors looking at the space, this would be the most sort of investable proposition, I believe, at the current moment. There are, of course, we do like to see that sort of moonshot potential, that there is this possibility of addressing that big, broad question. But I think we do need to see more science as well as a clearer regulatory path forward with regard to that before it becomes an attractive proposition on its own.
Thank you, Gerald. So I can see we have a question as well from Sivan. So I will enable your microphone in just a moment, Sivan, and then we might open the conversation out. I feel like we could talk about investing in biotech for hours, but let's also try and widen the conversation and look at some of the more, I suppose, the wider definitions and some of the things to be considered when we talk about longevity investing as well. But Sivan, I'm going to enable your microphone now. So you'll be coming online in just a moment. There we go. Please go ahead.
Hello, Siam Sivalos here. This is a question to all the panel, but maybe to Jens in particular. It's about the possibility of approaching regulators with a reprogramming project or clinical project. So we are seeing more and more biotech companies going forward, aging, reprogramming, or cell reprogramming. So Jens, if you go for such biotech company, what would be your strategy in clinical development and especially in approaching the regulators?
So would anybody like to take that on? Jens, are you happy to offer an opinion?
I mean, I think reprogramming, technically you can look at it as a new modality of drug. And, you know, it's a little bit like gene therapy where you actually introduce a new biological effect. So I think you just have to go through the safety studies with that new modality. I think it is not really known what reprogramming really entails and what the safety issues and side effects are. So I think, again, you know, you have to go through a phase 1 program and convince the FDA that it's safe. I would just look at it as a new modality. That's how I would approach it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jens. All right, so let's widen this conversation a little bit. And actually, we've had a great question in from Anne-Marie on the chat. So I'll just read it out, and I'd like to take a few different views on this. So let me know your thoughts, please, panel. So are there views on investing in public consumer education to create awareness of products and services, solutions that assist people to age healthily? So in other words, how do we drive adoption of solutions that exist now to set up a successful investment pathway for new longevity solutions? I might, to put you on the spot here, Jonathan, throw to you on this one, please. I know we've talked about public education in the past, so perhaps if you're happy to start up, and if everyone else is, have a think, and if you've got any thoughts on to contribute, let me know.
Yeah, of course. So if we're talking, I think about essentially investing in how we kind of educate aging populations about the tools that already exist for them out there. And I think that it is a key thing. And I think it's very important that we do broaden the discussion on longevity away from just looking at biotech and aging, and think much more about the societal impact of it, which came up in the panel earlier. And we are a little bit like in danger as a you know, venture investment community of continuing to invest in products and services that are being consumed by younger people, because it's younger entrepreneurs developing solutions for younger people. And I think that there are so many opportunities for investing in slightly older markets, you know, 40, 50, 60-year-olds who they're becoming more and more digitally aware, particularly at the moment with everything that's happening with COVID, which is kind of forcing digital adoption amongst all age groups to go up. And so I think that there are huge opportunities for investors, and I think that there are big opportunities for entrepreneurs. I don't know whether the question was aimed specifically at publicly funded programs, but I think it's an area where entrepreneurs should be looking at with a bit more zeal than they currently are, because you've got, you know, the consumers between the ages of 40 and 60 who are going to be the next, you know, aging market, longevity market, and they've got digital awareness, they've got money to spend, they've got future problems that they need to solve using new solutions. So I think there are big opportunities, and I think it's something investors should be looking seriously at.
Thanks, Jonathan. Cliff, what are your thoughts?
I just absolutely with that, and I think you know, there is a great deal to be done by way of age inclusive products and services. You know, at the moment we're just sort of we're offering up objects, services largely of shame and failure and decline, rather than saying, hey, you know, you're 70-year-old but you're fit. Where, you know, what's the road bike that you really like to buy? What's, you know, being much more positive, more inclusive. We see it in gyms now. We've got a number of gym chains that take an age inclusive approach. I'm intrigued by the obesity epidemic and what's happening on that, where there's some really interesting work going on, which is both grant and government supported work to understand the situation and provide information, but at the same time to create healthier snack opportunities, the sort of things that people just will pick up and do all terrible things to their bodies by taking rubbish food, actually switching those to healthier options, but healthier options which are tasty, which are appealing to particular audiences. Is that a model? And that's happening quite widely now in the obesity field. Is that the kind of model that we ought to be looking for in later life as well?
And what about the fact from there, Cliff, that there's an emerging number of entrepreneurs over 50? I mean, for the biotech space, this is nothing new. A lot of the entrepreneurs we see in biotech are older adults by way of, people need to have a significant amount of experience. But how is that likely to change both the sort of products that are being developed, but also thinking about types of investors? I mean, there's a whole range of investors who invest just in female founders. Could you see a space, and I might also ask Alice to feed in on this, please, where perhaps people are dedicated towards investing in older adult entrepreneurs?
I am sure that that's the case, but what that's saying is, we have to wait year by year as entrepreneurs and investors get 1 year older, 2 years older. We need to get faster than that. We need to get way faster than that. But I think we can get way faster than that because, we've got this backlog of people who have been told once you get to a certain chronological age, you should give up. And I think people are starting to fight that. People are starting to fight out of that. So I do think this will, from entrepreneurs, from innovators, from investors, from marketeers, from product developers, and so on. I think this will start to race ahead now because we'll break through this stuff that we've had telling us that what we shouldn't do when we're a certain chronological age. I think Alice is hopping off her feet.
Yeah, no, I've also been here since 9 a.m. No, I fundamentally believe in human imagination. Yeah. I mean, I talk about this when I talk about female founders. Like, I don't let the guys off the hook. No, you're not a female, but you should be able to use your imagination as a venture capitalist to figure out, that a female founder might be able to be successful as well. So similarly, I don't think that we should necessarily wait for us to be in that demographic to necessarily have to be able to be successful investors there. I think that's letting half of humanity or more off the hook, and that's not cool. I mean, you all have parents, don't you? As a nice filial, Asian sort of female, it's like, I think you can be empathetic. So, but that being said, it also is important to have inclusivity in our investing criteria. And that some insights are easier if you have to live with it. So, for example, talk about obesity. You guys are familiar with the fat suit that people put on in order to sort of imitate sort of how does it feel to be overweight or how does it feel to be elderly, and that yields insights that can be extremely helpful. We have actually seen fund managers with sort of longevity targeted investment theses. They tend to be, within specific subsectors and so on. So I think that might be coming. But equally, we also see sort of more, the laterals that Gerald was talking about that sort of include this as sort of a mega trend. And I think both are fine, quite frankly. There's room for different ways of skinning this particular cat.
Great, thank you, Alice.
Yeah.
Gerald, please.
Yeah, no, I just would like to echo what Jonathan said. And there's a lot of, hype around millennials, Generation Z. But really what the money is with the 50, 60, 70-year-old. And if you think about it, who's better positioned to know what are the needs of that generation than people that are in the generation? So if you think about someone who's now, let's say, 50 or 55, had a career maybe in multiple industry or in one particular industry, and still in very good health, I mean, that person is probably the best position to start a new product or address a need that would fit not only for him, but all the people of his generation, which again, we're not talking about 5 or 10% richer than the combination of even of Generation Z or millennials. It's almost a multiple of wealth that you have in the hands of people that are 50, 60, 70. And I think backing entrepreneurs that have a lot of experience, either in business or in other areas, and that have an idea to address some of the needs, I think make a lot of sense from an investment perspective.
Yeah, I'm going to get the numbers slightly wrong on this, but I think it's actually that the cult of the youth is actually not quite right. I think the median age, I'm going to get this quite, don't quote me, but I think the median age of the successful entrepreneur is about 45, which means that quite a few are actually older. I say successful, I'm not saying the ones that start, I'm saying the ones that actually manage to make the company, last more than 3 years. So just a thought. I mean, part of it is they start off with more money, and more runway is always helpful. So.
Connections maybe as well.
Yeah.
All right.
Social capital. There you go.
Thanks, everyone. Okay, so I'm going to turn to a question that's come in on the chat, and actually was also reflected in one of the pre-submitted questions that came through. And just a reminder to everyone that if you would like to ask a question out loud, please just to use the hand raise button, and I'll enable your microphone to do so. But the question, and I'm sorry to bring up COVID, we had to touch on it at some point. The question is, for you all as investors in longevity, how or have you changed your or reassessed your investment strategy in light of COVID? And I'd love to get everyone's opinion on this, please. If you prefer not to, just let me know. But because everyone comes from such different backgrounds, I think it would be great to get an opinion from everyone. So Laurence, let's start with you, if that's okay.
Yes, of course. And I think my clear answer is yes, to some degree, of course we have, but the fundamentals remain the same. So it's an adjustment. It's not a fundamental shift. So of course we've gone back and looked at our portfolio and the needs, and made extra allocations for companies that are perhaps not going to raise as quickly, or in fact need to have stronger syndicates around them, and so allocated additional capital, for example, there, and particularly with R&D programs slowing down or clinical trials not being able to be executed. Having said that, that's not been as strongly impacting our portfolio as we initially anticipated. So people have been very creative about how they get the job done. Whether you're talking companies here in the UK, on the continent, or in the US, it's been fantastic to see. People are really creative about using different suppliers to work with, or getting their labs and keeping their labs open. I think the fundamentals, though, remain the same. If there are good, strong investments, then we are pursuing them, and we've just closed 3 over the last 2 months. So we've had a very busy time, despite being working from different offices. Obviously, when we look at them, from our perspective, we are thinking that we're not going to close very small seed investments where they may have to be back out on the road in 3 or 6 months because we don't know the environment. So we are thinking about these investments as longer term plays, trying to build more robust syndicates and at least get commitments around the table for greater amounts of money. They're still structured in obviously, to manage risk very carefully, but fundamentally to get stronger support. So if they have to, they hit their milestones, but they can't raise as quickly, for example, then there is that deep support around the table to continue. So we're not fundamentally changed things, but we are obviously taking the current market, and we don't know, we can't predict what it's going to be like in the near term. So we're saying 12 to 18 months of cash at least in some form available, so that the companies have a longer term perspective.
Thank you. Alice, I'll come to you next. I saw you waving your hand there.
Okay, I just thought I'd inject some data into the conversation. One, there's a heck of a lot of dry powder still out there. Okay, and of course people should always be careful with our money, please. But yes, now probably more so, but there is actually a lot of dry powder. Okay, 2, if things are taking a little bit longer, at least here in the UK, we've just launched the Future Fund, which is a bridge finance. Now, we don't want to build bridges to nowhere, so it's a matching program. But if if professional investors can back it up, like they've got conviction in their portfolios, there is help to, and I mean, I know my continental counterparts also have similar programs, although I don't think they're up yet, and ours is, but not that I'm competitive. So there's help, there's money. Come talk to it. If you're in the UK, come talk to us. And 3, Actually, I've seen some. I know that one of the questions here was about the angels at the seed stage. And funnily enough, the latest piece of data that I just saw in the angel survey, and it's difficult to target that sector, suggests that actually more deals are being done right now, and they're at higher ticket sizes, and they're new deals. Okay, despite the fact that the high net worths have definitely seen what's known as the denominator problem, which is to say that their total net worths have gone down because of the public markets. It's a little interesting. We think it might be a lagging factor just because it takes a while for the due diligence to do transactions, and we have to watch that and see where it goes. But I don't think you should make it an automatic assumption that that the angel side of the seed is falling off a cliff just yet. I mean, I know you guys are talking about anecdotal data. I'm looking at a survey of several hundred angels in the UK, and I was surprised by it, but that's what we're seeing in the data right now. So it might be happening, but not quite yet. I think there is genuinely a lot of momentum and dry powder, and people are careful, but that doesn't mean they're not doing transactions. I mean, I know of some VCs who've been doing IC remotely by Zoom, right, and sort of getting deals done remotely.
We do that every day, every week.
Yeah. So you know, don't take it as an excuse of nothing's happening.
I mean, Gerald, this is sort of the community of people that you work with at times. Can you feed in some insight here?
Yeah, no, it's true that I think family offices definitely have cash to invest. You're right, there's a lot of dry powder out there. I think it's true they are probably more cautious and waiting a bit, but also if there's a good opportunity, because they have that ability to invest for the long term. And here we're talking about a very much a long-term trend, longevity. I think you still get deals done because people want to be part of it. And it's not a question of what's happening over the next 3 months, 6 months, or even 12 months. It's really something that is much longer than what we are going through at the moment in terms of crisis. So the cash is there, the willingness to invest as well. And I think we haven't seen much change on our side when it comes to the willingness of people to invest if it is a good investment opportunity. That's for sure.
Thanks, Gerald.
Sorry, I'm going to jump in with one last thing, which is because we've been through the cycle before as an institutional investor, we know that some of our best vintages are in the recession years. Yeah. I mean, that's not to put too fine a point on it, but the return multiples are better for us historically. Fewer deals, but better.
No, and I agree. And I think that's a trend, like when you go towards the private market, which of course, venture capital is, this is definitely one of the best time to invest. And that's also the message we've been saying to our investors and our clients.
So let's see what our VCs have to say on this then, and get a VC perspective. Jens, I might start with you, please, if you're happy to do that.
Yeah, so I mean, VC is much more long term. So I don't think that we have really changed anything. I think you should never burn money. You should raise money whenever you can. I think that rule hasn't changed. On the contrary, the whole COVID-19 crisis really has raised things like immunosenescence. It really has raised, the understanding that we can actually become a much safer society if we figure out how to age more healthy. So I think there will actually go money in our way, and we see it from some of our investors we're talking to who are upping at this point. But it's clearly also a denominator problem. It depends very much on how rich some of those rich people feel today, and how rich they feel in the next quarter. So I think it will be a year of a give and take, but I definitely see this as a big opportunity for healthcare companies.
Great. And Xinhong, can you feed in some thoughts here?
Yeah, absolutely. And I again would say that yes, fundamentals haven't changed. So strategically, we haven't changed. Our investment criteria is still the same. We're looking for platforms of breakthrough technology that are defensible, that are addressing large problems, and certainly longevity or aging-related issues is a massive unmet need. And we're interested in companies that are in this area, and we'll always be looking for good opportunities in this area. That said, the tactics do have to adjust to the situation. The reality is that sentiment has certainly turned a lot more cautious. This is definitely the sense that we're getting on the ground, all the way from the large institutions who have their allocations out of whack and so have to rebalance. And so that could mean that if they're taking losses in the public, that they have to readjust their private market allocations. That means potentially less capital flowing to the private investors. And I know there are large institutions that are trying to remedy this by opening the spigot, but this is the reality for many other large institutions. Their allocations may be out of whack. This has then a trickle-down effect, right? The private investors who take this money from the institutional investors may then find it difficult to deploy the money. And from the ground up, there are indeed high net worths and wealthy family offices where we see that liquidity is king, cash is king. There are deals in the pipeline that they want to complete, and they will complete and have completed, but then they want to stay liquid for quite a while. So I think the reality on the ground is going to be that there will be a lot of wait and see. The focus will be on opportunities already in the pipeline, particularly for groups that emphasize a lot on doing due diligence in person. They will probably focus on the opportunities that come from groups that they have already met in person, for instance. And there will be a lag time. I think people will have to readjust to this new reality of trying to do due diligence through video conferencing call. And I think it's a matter of time that people will adjust to that. But there will be many investors who will find it difficult to make that sort of adjustment. On our end at Vickers, we're again as well conducting business as usual, investment committee calls on a regular basis, constantly and consistently looking for opportunities. We're applying the same fundamental strategy as always. But we are advising our companies that we have to batten down the hatches. The fundraising environment is cautious. It's potentially challenging. But interestingly, where we see private investment or funding opportunities may be more challenging, there are more opportunities to obtain public financing from groups such as the Future Fund or the British Business Bank. And so indeed, some of our UK companies are actively vigilantly watching for opportunities such as this. One of our portfolio companies, SciSav, is exploring such opportunities as well. And we have a few UK companies that are looking at these ways to help to bridge the environment. So even while these companies' fundamentals remain strong, there's always, it's always good to get extra help. And I encourage companies to look creatively for these opportunities to help to bolster their cash position, and to look for investors that are willing to help them as well. Because as I know, the Future Fund scheme is interesting in the way that it's an investor-led process. And so you do have to find investors that are willing to really roll up the sleeves and spend that time and help to lead this process with the company. So as with anything, the fundamentals remain the same. Pick your investors carefully, and investors should pick their companies carefully as always as well.
Thank you. And Cliff, I could see you were keen to feed in there.
Yeah, this really from the impact investing world, and 4 points in two types. The first two from Big Society Capital. For us, liquidity is everything for our portfolio to succeed in the longer term. So compared to our typical 80 million a year allocation, we've allocated 100 million a year for liquidity, for both the immediate risk and the resilience as we come out of the recovery. The second thing from Big Society Capital is we see early stage venture as the best place to invest for new investments. So I think that echoes some of the other comments that have been made. But more broadly, globally, the impact investing world, this point that we've seen for a while, and now it really stands out, is that impact investments are almost not at all correlated to mainstream markets, and have not been affected nearly as much by the mainstream markets. So this is something that hopefully we will be able to sell for the future from the impact investing world. The other is how organizations that used to compete rather catastrophically, now work collaboratively for much better results. So, for example, in America, in Europe, in a number of other jurisdictions, organizations have come together to create platforms and facilities. So, for example, if I was a high net worth investor, I'm really interested in something in Kenya. I haven't invested in Kenya before, but there are a lot of other high net worth investors who have. Let's rely on their due diligence rather than having to do some kind of really fancy, probably phone only in Kenya, due diligence of our own. So simplifying, using all the data that we already have to make it much easier for investors to put money where they want it, where their values lie. And you just think, why couldn't we have done that before? Why did it take a global pandemic in order to push people to much more effective ways of working? But it's there and it's great.
Thank you, Chris. Jonathan, did you have anything to add to that?
I'll go back and more or less echo exactly what Laurence said right at the beginning. It's no real long-term shift in outlook. I think if anything, as a healthcare investor, there's opportunities have been created, and certainly a lot of the industries that we've invested in, there's an acceleration, a rapid acceleration in the adoption of certain technologies. So yeah, short term, things a bit up in the air. You've got to look after the portfolio, as Laurence says. You've got to allocate more money to the companies that need it. We've definitely got some applications coming for the future fund, Alice, you'll be pleased to know. But long term, I don't think that much changes, particularly not in aging society and longevity. This is long term, and I don't think the long term fundamentals will change that much as a result of this crisis.
Thanks, Jonathan. And finally, Reenie, you come at this from a slightly different angle, but anything to add to this discussion segment?
Yeah, really just echoing what other people have said. I think, we're a public company, so in the public markets, certainly biotech is still open for business from an investment perspective. But to echo, again, what Laurence introduced, and I think others have echoed, both in terms of investors we're speaking to, our own investors and others, as well as our bankers and surveys of public market investors, the cash is king, construct, making sure companies are well capitalized with 12 to 24 months of cash. We were already facing a little of that in the US with an election year cycle coming up, but I think with COVID and the uncertainty of, when peaks may come again, that longer term cash runway has become, quite important for companies. But I agree, just in terms of making progress, staying on track, all of that, the industry has been quite resilient, and I think, has done a good job through the crisis so far.
That's good to hear. So I can see that Greg has raised his hand and would like to make a comment, I presume, on this topic. So Greg, I'm just going to bring you in briefly. So you should be able to speak now, Greg.
Thanks, Angela. I really appreciate it. So I have a question that I think relates to the root of all of this, which is the source of deals lying in early stage research that typically can only be funded through philanthropic capital. And I'm curious to hear all of your thoughts on how we can accelerate that. Because of course there's rather little for all of us to invest in unless those seeds are sown.
Yeah, I've heard it talked about as bread on the water out of my university. I spent a lot of time with the various research universities in the UK talking about how to get the R&D that is inside those institutions out into something that you guys can actually invest in. Because it takes a while. Just the basic proof of scientific concept. Quite frankly, it's blue sky stuff. As someone who has money, like commercial money with venture capitalists, I can't really, say that that's your job, because the risk, the payoff factors are more like 1 in 20, 1 in 50 sometimes. And it takes a while. So a lot of that should be, at least in the UK. I think in the US as well, it used to come from sort of various grant giving bodies. And yeah, I know the US has kind of pulled back, hasn't it? Yeah, Reenie is nodding, and I'm like, I'm pretty sure it's pulled back. The philanthropic, at least the U.S. does still have a lot more, major philanthropic institutions that have stepped in a bit. In the UK, we only have the Wellcome Trust, really. We don't have as many as you guys do. And so the government has felt the need to come in. I think the Gerald's worlds of the high net worths and family offices, have stepped, so in the UK, we have tax incentives, SEIS, EIS, which encourages high net worths to sort of come in at that early stage. But we call this, where angels fear to tread, right? It's particularly with life sciences, it's tough. It is tough. And I think the only answer is you do need to have some sort of blended finance, which is a concept that I know Cliff is aware of from the social impact sort of space as well. But I'm not sure there's a magic bullet, to be honest.
Reenie, did you want to make a comment there? You're just on mute.
Just quickly, I came from Morningside, which is an early stage life sciences investor, and our technology at Stealth actually was a serendipitous discovery from a lab at Cornell. So I'm familiar with, pulling technology out of institutions. I think some of it is finding investors, early stage life science investors who will go around and spend time with universities and dig for this and pull it out and set it up, incubate it. There are incubator funds that, this is their bread and butter. But I think the other piece actually sits with the universities. Certainly in the US, university tech transfer, it can be easy or it can be challenging. So I think there's kind of two angles to come at to sort of facilitate, the exodus over into science that frankly will get across the line for the greater good. It's sitting in universities, it's not going to quite ever get to where it needs to get.
Thanks, Reenie. So we're coming to the end of our time, and I don't know about everyone else, but this last hour has just flown by. Thank you all for your questions. I'm actually going to finish up with one final question that's come in on the Q&A. And then can I suggest to anyone, if you're keen to continue this discussion, to move over to the lounge. We have our speaker meetup actually starting right now, so we'll do a very, very quick wrap up. But I would encourage everyone to head over to the lounge. It is a written chat rather than a verbal one. But it's certainly a good place if people are keen to continue this discussion. There's certainly for any of the questions that we've potentially not got to do that. But my last question has come in from Cynthia at UKRI. And forgive me, Cynthia, for a slight change to the wording. So Cynthia is asking if an aging society community opportunity is clearly understood, and I would actually expand that to the longevity opportunity, because I would also argue that on biotech, side, if this opportunity is understood, the opportunity for the impact that both the science but also the tech that we're seeing for in the age tech space is understood, then why isn't the market thriving just yet? So Cynthia's asked, is it a lack of innovative solutions? Is it the lack of investment? Or is it the difficulty of scaling and generating appropriate ROI? So I'd like to hear the panel's thoughts on that just very quickly. Let's start with a biotech take, and then we'll widen out a little bit. So we'll start with you, please, Jens.
I think one of the reasons on the biotech side and the therapeutic side is because it really involves a huge paradigm shift, and the whole medical system will have to change to some extent. And to change a medical system, like the US, is an incredibly difficult thing because of a lot of silos, because people, protecting their turfs. I think we need the paradigm shift that we actually really go full force into preventive medicine, and we're not there yet. That's going to take a little while.
Thanks, Jens. Xinhong, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think many of the things that we have already mentioned, sometimes challenges on the regulatory front, around a definition of what it means to be developing solutions for, say, lifespan extension, even the science, where, do we have a sort of consensus around what are the key mechanisms that are underlying this? There are several promising approaches now, and I think have already been developed, but the FDA is taking its cue from a consensus that it may not necessarily be seeing a very strong sense of right now. And so I think this is something to address. Again, the age-related diseases approach seems to be a tractable way forward in the interim. And as Jens said as well, it's sort of reconfiguring the reactive system to be a more preventive system. That is something that needs rejiggering as well.
Thank you. Reenie, I'll just get your insight on this, please.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, I think on the biotech side, a lot of it is about solutions and what is the pathway. I think as you start to see companies breaking through with biotech, and it starts to some extent with biomarkers, so advances in diseases that can be translatable across broader diseases of aging, and then to aging itself, that's kind of where the tipping point will come, but it takes time to get there.
Thank you. Laurence, you work in biotech, but a little wider than aging, just aging science. What's your take on this?
So obviously concur strongly with what's been said. I think I would just add, and I think you mentioned it in your question, you know, the capital flowing into this space, and certainly from our perspective, it's much better than it was 4 years ago when we started out, but it's still well behind some of the areas where success has begun to be seen. Oncology, immunology, you can pick many areas these days. So I suppose my point is only we do need to see some sort of success in order to encourage a greater inflow of capital. And from my perspective, we've made huge strides in that direction, but we're not there. You know, I think we've got some steep hills to climb yet. But I think we get one or possibly two successes, or what are deemed to be successes, we'll start to see a more robust inflow of capital. And whether we're talking on the private side or the public side, I think that the themes, of course, are the same. So we're not there yet, even there. And obviously echo on the other components that together will make up a more successful environment to be in. I just picked on the capital because we hadn't, explicitly discussed it.
Thanks, Laurence. Jonathan, anything to add to that?
So yes, to echo that, I think capital follows, exits and track record, and I think bringing more capital into the market at every level encourages more entrepreneurship in the space, and more capital will come when more successes come. So if we saw a few big exits across, branded as age tech or branded as longevity, then that would encourage more investment in the space, more entrepreneurs, and and more success.
Hopefully that's something we can start to see as this field widens. Cliff and Alice, who would like to start? Cliff, perhaps you're ready to go?
Sure, yeah. Two things really. One is that the market that for people with later life, the problem is more about marketing than it is about products. There are products, there are services. They're just not marketed properly as yet, and there is a huge opportunity there for companies that wake up and look at this properly to take a big step forward. In terms of people who need support, whether that's in midlife with preventative interventions or late life when they may need care homes and so on. I really do believe that there is going to be an enormous change. The mass death in care homes in so many countries is such a scandal that I think we can believe there will be better approaches. Now, at the moment, the system is highly about government and regulatory and so on, and that's a big part of the problem. But I see, for example, in the Q&A, Anne-Marie Wright has suggested, aging in place, new residential models, age-friendly communities. I think all of these have a really bright future, and I hope so, because I don't want to ever be in one of the care homes that the government pays for at the moment in the UK. Really.
Well, and yeah,
assuming we can do way better than that.
That's all of our futures, right? I mean, if we don't die first. So,
Well, hopefully the work that people like Apollo and Vickers Ventures are doing and what Reenie is doing itself is going to enable us to be more healthy for longer as well. Alice, did you have anything to add to that?
No, not at all. I mean, I just concur with everyone else. I mean, traction and, getting adoption brings in the money. I mean, successful exits that gets you the investment. And actually, I do think the COVID situation is interesting because you see even Zoom that we're using right now, or some of the ed tech sort of apps, right? Like they weren't getting traction until something changed, and now they're getting traction, and you best believe they're getting investment as well. right? But what happened was something drove adoption. Yeah, and you need adoption rates, and you need that that to happen. And I think that we haven't talked about is stigma, right? Aging, and well, Cliff has actually. Taking therapeutics avoids this because taking medicine is okay, right? It's particularly for specific sort of indications, right? The broader range of longevity is harder because it suffers from stigma. Stigma blocks sort of traction and getting adoption rates that drive your revenues and drive your exits, quite frankly. So I think we should try not to shy away from sort of this age agnostic sort of approach to life, but it's definitely that drives. It's not the money. Money follows where there's success, I think.
Thanks, Alice. Well, look, Andrew Scott made a comment yesterday that that COVID is showing us the true meaning of disruption. So we are hopeful from all the terrible things that are happening in the world at the moment that there will be some good. And one of the things is this renewed focus on both our health in later life and also the products and services that we currently have for aging populations and how they potentially need to change and evolve. So with that, I'm going to close this discussion. Thank you so much to all of you for your time. It's been a real pleasure talking with you all, and enjoy the rest of the conference.